In this video, we're going to be going through the group to tiles options. This already existed in UVPackmaster 2, however, it has been significantly improved in UVPackmaster 3. What this does is the packer divides the islands into a specific number of groups, and using those groups provided it packs every group into a specific area in a UV space. Now in UVPackmaster 3, you've got a lot more control over this. Now this is the character that we're going to be using as an example, and you can see that there's multiple materials across multiple objects. Now we're just going to be looking at the UV screen because that's what we're focusing on here. Now to set up the groups to tiles, in the main mode, select the drop down and go group to tiles. Now we've got this secondary option down the bottom. So with the grouping methods, we've got the material, the mesh parts, the objects, the tile, and the grouping scheme. Now the first four options that we have are all automatic. So let's just show material, and then I'm going to go pack. And you can see that now it has packed the UVs into each individual material. So for instance, we can see that one of the materials is samurai, and this is my samurai material in its own UV space. Now we've also got the mesh parts, which is each individual mesh. So when you go Control L, everything that is linked to that mesh will become its own UV. Objects is obviously its own object. Each individual object that we have kind of like up here, the armor, the arrows, the body, and so on and so forth. And then the tiles here will kind of just order the UV spaces in number order. So let's talk about the group layout mode now. So we can see our tile count per group. I've got one here. What that means is that for each UV space, there is only the one UV map. So now if I go ahead and increase that to 2 and go pack, we can see now that our UVs have doubled. So now we've got 2 UV spaces for the head, flag, eyes, samurai, just allowing us to make bigger UV maps. Now with the group layout mode as well, what we can do is we can change it so it's horizontal. So if I go pack, all our UVs will flow horizontally, or we can go vertically. And so that's a really nice feature to keep yourself organized. So let's come down the bottom here and look into the Texel Density Policy. Now this option determines how relative the textile density of the particular group is handled during packaging. You can think about relative textile density as a proportion between UV islands. So let's consider 2 islands of a particular size, okay? If you scale them both with the same factor, we'll say that its relative textile density was maintained. So kind of like the proportions between the islands didn't change. But if you scale them using 2 different factors, or scale one of them, then you change the relative textile density because you change the proportion between the islands. So far, we've used the independent policy, and with this policy, the packer scales every group independently during packaging so that every group consumes as much of the UV space as possible. As a downside though, a relative textile density between group is not maintained, simply because every group is scaled with a different scaling factor. Now, when we switch to uniform textile density policy, the packer will scale all UVs within the same factor during packaging. And so kind of the relative textile density between groups will be maintained. But the downside is that some of the groups may not consume the whole UV tile as they were intended to be packed into. Now, I'm going to show you an example of such a situation. I've undone everything and I've come back to kind of the start. And now we're going to be looking at the uniform textile density policy. So I'll increase the count per group up to 2 as well. And this will give us a bit more of a better representation. And also we'll change the group mode to vertical, and let's press pack. And as you can see, only the last group consumes all its UV tiles. And the reason for this is because the last group cannot be scaled any further. And this is due to the lack of space in the UV tiles. That's why other groups cannot be scaled either, simply because the scaling factor has to be the same for all the groups when using the uniform policy. So what this means is the relative textile density of the island, as you see here, was maintained. But in this particular case, such as the requirements significantly limited the possibility to use the available UV space for the other groups. Now this problem can be mitigated when using the manual grouping, so let's go have a look at that now. So with the grouping method, I'm going to go material and we're going to go into group scheme manual. Now with the grouping scheme method, you get to define a set of named UV groups on their own and assign UVs to the group manually. So this gives you full control all over the assignment. Now, a set of user-defined UV groups is maintained in a single group scheming. So that means a single blend file may contain many different grouping schemes, and you can easily switch between them. Now, every scheme maintains a set of options. Some of them were already available for automatic grouping methods, but some of the options provide extra choices because it's not available for the automatic grouping methods. So that's why you have so much more control over the entire process when using the manual grouping. So let's kind of start looking through it. So let's go new grouping scheme. The default name for the new scheme will simply be scheme. And obviously we can change it. Let's click on there and go, we'll change it to my scheme. And by default, every new scheme only contains one UV group at the beginning. It's just default. And that's what the D represents, is the default. So if we come down into the bottom, we can go show group assignment, and we can see now that it's all linked to one group. However, we can go ahead and add some more. So let's add 6 more. Let's live a little. And then I'm going to quickly rename all these so we can select them, F2. And so now I've renamed the groups. If we go ahead and box select this last group, and we'll select the web one, and we're going to assign islands to the group, we can now confirm that they've been assigned to that bottom group. Let's go ahead, select the lenses, and we'll click assign to group. And now let's just quickly go through and select everything else. And you just got to be really careful. Make sure you get all of them. Control L. Just want to make sure there's no sneaky ones lying around. There we go. And now everything should be assigned to its group. If we want to make sure we've assigned everything, we can come to the bottom here and show group assignment. And that's our purple. This is our blue. I just want to make sure there's no other colors involved. Yeah, nice. Now I'm going to show you how much flexibility we have with the grouping scheme method. Now if we come into the group layout methods, you can now see that the manual down the bottom has been added. So we'll select that. This will now give us full control over where every UV group will be packed into the UV space. And that also includes the number and positions of target boxes for every group. Now if we scroll down a little bit more, in order to render the current box configuration and enable the box edit mode, you have to come to the bottom and select this edit scheme target box. So just to make my life easier for now, I'm going to have everything selected and press H. I just want to hide all the UVs and I just want to work with the boxes. So the main thing here is we can see that there's brackets around the SAM box. Now this is the active box, and we can obviously change which box is the active box by selecting our scheme group, or we can actually select our boxes as well. Now, if we scroll down a little bit further, we see that we've got a whole bunch of more options, and you can see that we can actually move these boxes around. There you go, back here, buddy. So this gives you full control over where the boxes are positioned. And we can see over here in the group target box, this is where our values are sitting. Now I can press the plus sign here next to group target boxes to create 2 more boxes. Let's select the sandbox, for instance. I can press a plus sign, and you can see that it goes onto the end of the row. Let's go ahead and we'll just put it back up over here. Now let's have a look at the packing of the group scheme. So Alt H to unhide everything. You can see now that these UVs are out, or they're not in the box, sorry. However, if we come to the top here and we press pack, we can just see how everything's been repackaged. So as you can see, all the groups filled their target tiles easily because we packed the independent Texel Density Policy. So every group was kind of scaled independently during packaging. But the relative Texel density between the groups was not maintained. Let's go back from the previous part of the tutorial where effectively packing with a uniform Texel Density Policy, and that's in order to maintain relative Texel density for all UV groups. Now I'll show you how to maintain the relative Texel density and still use the entire UV space effectively. And that's all thanks to this grouping scheme method. So I'm going to go back to here. Let's go down here and select our Texel Density Policy and change it to uniform. And now when we press pack again, we can see, for instance, these lenses got a little bit bigger, but once again, they weren't filled completely. And this is due to the same reason when we use the uniform policy in the first part of this tutorial. Now we can mitigate this problem by using the group scheme method. So kind of like some groups can be packed together into the same space. So their target boxes can actually be on top of each other. Now let me show you this. If we come down into Edit Scheme Target Boxes and click the button, we can see probably head and neg. They would probably fit together. So let's select that one. And I'm just going to move it all the way to the left. And we can see that they're overlapping. I'm just going to hide the UVs just so we can see the names a bit better. Let's grab our flag box, move it over. And so we're going to have the flag, the head, and the nag all together. Let's mash together the lenses and the eyes, move that over. I'm going to press Alt-H to bring all our UVs back. Let's go up the top and press Pack. So that's looking a lot more dense, which is nice. So if we come down into Show Group Assignments, we can see now how the particular groups were packed. Now, if we kind of come in and have a look at the first tile, we can see how they were all packed together. So the interesting thing is when the groups are all packed into the same UV space, the order of the group packing is determined by the order of the scheme group list. So the nag group was packed into the tile first, hence it covers the bottom part of the tile as a result. And after that, it was the head group that was packed into the space. And then the flag group up here was packed at the very end. Now, obviously we can change these around. So if I select the head, we bring it to the top, and with everything selected again, I'm just going to press Pack. Let's come down and we'll show group assignments. And now you can see that the head is down the bottom because that's what went first. So let's go ahead and have a look at the custom Texel Density Policy. So in our previous operation, we can see that the lenses and eye groups were packed like this, and obviously there's a lot more space that we can fill them up. Now the reason why they're this side is because the packer couldn't scale those islands up any further, and that's due to being instructed to keep their Texel density the same as all the other islands. So this is the uniform Texel Density Policy. So we can go ahead and kind of fix this up by making our requirements on the Texel density uniformative weaker. So the idea is to split all groups into two logical clusters. So cluster 1, all groups except the eyes and lens groups, and cluster 2 is the eyes and the lens group only. So after we do that split, we can instruct the packer that it has to maintain the uniform density only within a cluster, but not between different clusters. So the entire cluster 1 will be scaled using a uniform scale factor during the packing of the entire cluster, and the second cluster will be scaled using another uniform factor, which is different to cluster 1 factor. So in such a setup weakens the requirements on Texel density uniformative. On the other hand, it'll allow cluster 2 to fill its target box to a better extent. So that's the general idea. Now let's go ahead and explain it, how it's set up in UVPackmaster. So we can come into the Texel Density Policy and change it from uniform to custom. Now the custom option is only available when we're using the grouping scheme method. So it's not available during the automatic grouping methods. So that's now enabled this group option, the Texel Density Cluster. So let's set that these two groups will belong to the same cluster, so their relative Texel density will be maintained during packing, if and only if they share the same value of this parameter, okay? So by default, the Texel density cluster of every group is set to 0. So it means that all groups belong to the same cluster. So by default, this policy behaves in the same way as the uniform Texel density policy that we covered earlier. Now to assign the lens group to another cluster, so cluster number 1, we can select the group and change the Texel density cluster to 1. Now we'll do that for the lenses as well, increase that to 1. So now both groups belong to a different cluster, so cluster number 1, and all the other groups will be on cluster 0. So if I click on head, 0, lens, 1, wep, 0. Let's press back. Now we can see that the eyes and the lens groups were scaled independently from all other groups, so they can fit the entire target box. At the same time, they were still dependent on each other, so they were both scaled with the same factor. Now this is because they belong to the same Texel density cluster. Let's come back to the top here and we're going to start looking at the pixel margin. So if we expand this out and enable it, the pixel margin allows you to set the exact margin between each of the islands in pixels. So for instance, if we bump it up to 7 and we kind of come in and we can see how these are all pretty tight. Let's go pack now. And now you can see that there is a bit of give in between the UV islands. Now the pixel padding parameter defines the distance between the UV islands and the box border. So by setting this parameter to 1 pixel, you can minimize the distance so there's more space in the box for packing the islands. Now setting the pixel padding to 0, which is the default value, will make the pixel padding functionality disabled. Let me show you. So let's press pack and have a look where we get to now. If we kind of zoom all the way in, we can see that it is very minimal around the box border, but we've still got that distance between the UV islands. Now the extra margin to others. Now this allows you to specify an additional margin, a value to add to the standard pixel margin setting between islands which are considered as others to each other. Now the islands are in the others relation to each other in the following cases, okay? Selected islands to unselected islands when using pack to others. But this case is not in the scope of this tutorial. So the second case, when the islands are in the others relation, is islands belonging to different UV groups. So when the groups are being packed into the same UV space. I'll show you an example of such a situation. So I'm going to change this extra margins to others. I'm going to bump that up to 10. And now the margin between the islands belonging to the same group would still be 7 pixels because we've got it determined up here. But the margin between the islands from different groups will be 7 plus 10, so 17 pixels. All right, so let's press pack and let's kind of zoom in on this one. We'll come down and show group assignments. And now if we come all the way in, we can see that between 2 UV islands, which are in the same group, we got a 7 pixel distance. However, between different groups, we've got 17 pixels. So you can see the gap's bigger. So let's go ahead and start looking at overriding the global options for particular groups. So looking at the top part here, we can see the packing options. These are part of the global options. So I'm going to come down into our scheme grouping. I've got the head already selected. And then from here, I'm going to go into the group options and select override global options. And as you can see, now we've got a list of extra options here. So if we come back into the global settings, we can see that the rotational step is 90. Now this is most optimal for processing islands which are rectangled shape. Now setting the rotation step to a lower value is beneficial for islands of irregular shapes only. So we don't want to change the rotation step value globally because a lot of islands in the UV map are rectangular shaped, but we want to override the value for the head group only, because the head group contains islands of irregular shapes. So we'll come back down, head selected. We want to put a tick next to the rotation step in the override global options. Now every option has its individual checkbox, so you can freely decide which option you want to override. Now I'm going to set the rotational step to maybe 10, and then I'm going to come to the top and press pack. Let's come down and show assignment groups. And now we can see that the head group itself was packed more densely this time, thanks to the lower rotational step value. Now in this last part, we're just going to do some common issues that may happen with manually grouping. Now the manual group assignment in Blender is in fact maintained on a per UV face basis. Now that's because Blender doesn't maintain any permanent structure describing UV islands. That's because at the beginning of every operation, the packer uses per UV face group assignment to determine the per UV island group assignment. An island is assigned to a group if and only if every UV face forming the given island is assigned to the group. So a problem arises when there are 2 faces in a single island which are assigned by the user to different groups. And so the assignment is not consistent. In such a situation, the packer cannot determine an assignment for the island and raises an error and then aborts the operation. So let's kind of demonstrate the situation just so you can have a bit of a better understanding. So I'm going to work with the head group and I'm just going to pick a few faces. And I'm going to come in and assign these faces to the nag group. So let's go assign island to group. And now what we've done is we've assigned half this mesh to the head, half, or a little bit of this mesh to the nag. And so now when we go ahead and select everything, press pack, you can see that we've got a whole bunch of errors. And that's because the packer has detected an assignment which is inconsistent and selects all the problematic UV islands and for which assignment group should be corrected. And of course, the operation, failed. Now, it is a fairly simple fix with everything selected. We just assign it to the one group. So we'll assign it to the head, assign island to group, select everything, and pack. And there we go. No more errors.